Marxism-Leninism is a very essential and foundational alteration of Marx and Engels' ideas. Because of conditions in Russia, because of conditions in the First World War, Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, Leon Trotsky, and all the other Russian, communist leadership basically had to change, in essence, Marx's ideas. Marx and Engels said that the first socialist nations would probably be either the United States or England. That to have socialism, you had to have an advanced industrial economy that could produce all the goods that people needed. How could you have rule by the working class when you didn't have a working class? Well, that was the situation in Russia. This was a very non-industrial country, had very little industry outside of the larger cities like Moscow and St. Petersburg and so forth. So how could you have a communist revolution in a place like Russia, which was undeveloped, agricultural, very backward? That's why a lot of people said, you're crazy. You can't possibly do that. It won't work. And, of course, in the end, it didn't work. The Soviet Union didn't fall apart because of Ronald Reagan. The Soviet Union fell apart because of its own economic instability and, its own inability to develop. What the Bolsheviks were going to have to do here, and this is why we call it Marxism-Leninism, is that you could have, they said, a communist revolution in an agricultural society, but you had to then industrialize under the auspices of communism. You had to skip the evolutionary stage of capitalism, and they believed they could do that and make it work. I know they couldn't. It looked like for a long time they could, but it wasn't actually viable. And that's really why communism failed. Not because of Reagan or not because of the Cold War necessarily or whatever, but because it was a very warped model of development. But that's, it's working apparently in China and some other places to different degrees. But communism, Marxism, is supposed to be a movement among advanced industrial nations. So what we see here is the Soviet experiment, an attempt to skip the stage of capitalist development, to industrialize as a communist nation, and to then advance towards capitalism and then socialism and later communism. So they put a distinct new spin on it, saying that capitalism is one phase, socialism is another, intermediary stage, and then the final stage will be communism. And of course, they never arrived in that, even though, as we'll see, Stalin proclaimed that communism was actually around in the 30s, but it wasn't, of course. So communism is very unusual and very different from Marxism. But one of the things that it becomes in the 20th century is another developmental model. So English-style, capitalism is one developmental model, and especially after the Second World War, Soviet-style Marxism-Leninism will become another developmental model, a way that you can modernize and advance your country. So keep that in mind for the post-World War II lecture. So communism is all about, obliterating traditional societies and their classes and their structures and their wealthy and their poor and so forth, equalizing people to some degree. But, there was never equality in the Soviet Union. It became non-democratic. It became anti-democratic. It became very much a rule by one party. It had the repression and the secret police and all these different things that, Marx didn't believe that it would have. I mean, this was not supposed to happen this way. But what you see is an idea that is put into action in very altered circumstances, that it was never meant to be put in action, in a situation like that. And the Soviets experiment in the 1920s and 30s and beyond and try to make it work. The other ideology in the period, directly a result of the First World War, is fascism. Fascism is very much a reaction to communism. You have to understand that in this First World War, people were mobilized with propaganda to hate others and the enemy without and the enemy within and so forth. So just like in Germany, the belief begins to grow in large part because of what Hindenburg says, the overall commander of the German army. When he comes back, he tries to cover his own behind and says, well, when the socialist government in Germany and the Socialist Party is the only party in Germany that could rule, and they try to transition to a democracy, when they do this inquiry about the causes and conduct of the First World War, because remember, for 4 years the Germans were lied to, like everybody else was, and told that we were winning the war. So after the war is over, the Kaiser, abdicates and flees to Holland to open up his flower shop, and everybody in Germany is going, what happened? Well, we're told for 4 years we were winning the war. How did we lose it? The socialist government of Germany, after the war, in the Weimar Republic, puts together a court of inquiry saying, what happened in the war? Hindenburg gets on the stand and says, well, the German army didn't lose the war, we were stabbed in the back. And people start to ask the question, stabbed in the back by whom? Well, stabbed in the back by internal enemies. You see, conspiracy theory. People love easy one-word answers. So eventually people come along, drawing on the existing racism and anti-Semitism in Germany, and answer the question, who stabbed us in the back, by saying the Jews, our enemy element within our society. So they start to craft this conspiracy theory in Germany and elsewhere. This fascism was a movement all around the world too, that internal enemies and external enemies work together to destabilize states and things like that. So the Nazis put together this idea that everything's a Jewish conspiracy, right? Capitalism is a Jewish trick, communism is a Jewish trick, Christianity is a Jewish trick, everything's a Jewish trick, right? So this is one of the aspects of fascism that we know from the Nazis. Germany wasn't the first fascist state. Italy was. In 1922, the Italian fascists under Mussolini take power. Mussolini was a former socialist, but he never really fit in with the socialists. What socialism was and what communism becomes and fascism becomes is an ideology for people who are not part of the ruling class, part of the ruling elite. You really had no other choice in a large part if you were poor in Europe. I met a very old English communist once, a British communist. He's like in his 90s now, and I asked him, I said, you know, why are you a communist? Why did you become a communist when you were young? And he said, well, because I was poor. Like it was the most natural thing in the world for a poor person to be a communist, but that's what you did. That was the only political movement for poor people in Europe. A lot of Europeans felt that way. They don't have this myth of upward mobility that we have in America to absorb those energies. Instead, they have this class system that still exists, and if you're poor, you're probably going to stay that way. You know, that was in the 20th century. A lot of people, even in America, of course, flirted with ideas of communism and socialism. So fascism is a result of that, too. Fascism, I know it's trendy to say today there's no difference between Nazis and communists. Fascists and communists are the same thing. Well, they're not. They're very different. Communists believe that, and socialists believe that the primary engine of history is class conflict, that classes fight for power, you know, for control of the state, for resources, and so forth. Fascism believes the direct opposite from that class conflict is not what drives history, but national or racial conflict. So in other words, whereas Marx said that you have more in common with, if you're an American, you have more in common with the working class in Mexico or Israel or Italy or wherever than you have with the wealthy people in your own nation. The fascists were the opposite and said, no, you have everything in common with people in your own nation, in your own race, in your own whatever. So fascism is hyper-nationalist. Everything is about the nation, about the race. They are also very much militaristic. They're very pro-military. They're very pro-traditional gender ideology. They're very pro-class. Marxism, socialism, communism wants to do away with classes, but fascism says that classes are fine. They have this sort of bizarre, you know, social Darwinist thing saying that people compete for wealth and resources, and if you are fit to survive, you'll rise to the top and become wealthy. And they also put that on a national basis, that nations through warfare, and that's warfare, of course, is hyper-masculinity. Through warfare, nations compete, races compete, and if they are superior, they will win and control more resources and more territory and so forth. So fascism is very nationalist. It's very militaristic. It's very, you know, prone towards traditional gender ideology and racism. Other than that, fascism is not a philosophy. Communism's a philosophy, but fascism's not. Fascism is an ideology of action. Fascism is anti-intellectual. There's no accident that Nazis burnt books. Reading books, learning books, that's very sort of, that's sissy activity. Real men don't read books. Real men pick up a gun, stomp somebody with their jackboot, that's what real men do, right? They are very anti-ideology. Fascists are very anti-politics. They hate capitalism, they hate communism, they hate democracy, any kind of politics. And of course, being anti-political is very political because you'll become the one in charge. So, don't think, listen to me, your Fuhrer, your Duce, right? Mussolini was the Italian Duce, the leader. Don't go out and vote. Democracy's for wimps. We need a strong man. We need the whole nation to get together and carry out some kind of war. So other than that, fascism is an ideology of action. It is anti-political, it's anti-intellectual, and it's very much a philosophy of violence and of struggle.